Well, today we're going to fit one of the most impactful upgrades you can actually make to an E30, which is a faster steering rack. Now, as you may know, the E30's original steering rack, which is this one, is a whole 4 turns lock to lock, which feels very sluggish, to be honest, and you can find yourself having to put in a lot of effort to use big armfuls of steering on a twisty road, so it makes the car not very responsive in its feel. To solve this, we're going to be fitting a faster steering rack to this E30 build, and there's a few options for steering rack upgrades for an E30. I've got, I believe, the 2 best options here alongside the original E30 steering rack for a visual comparison. The first rack, and probably the most common one to swap in these days, is this one, which is the E46 Clubsport rack, also affectionately known as the purple tag rack for obvious reasons. Now, this rack is 3 turns lock to lock, an entire turn less than the E30 one, which makes the car much more responsive to drive. They're also readily available, and you could pick one up quite cheap second-hand in decent condition like this one is, for around £60 if you're patient. A few years ago I had a 318 IS and I sent it away to have the conversion to the purple tag steering rack, and I remember how transformative it was for the car. The car felt way better and way more agile when I got it back, having had this rack swapped into it. So I know this is a really good option for an E30. One important thing to note about using the purple tag rack on an E30 is you need to make sure you're using vented inner tie rods. This is a standard E46 inner tie rod, and you can see there are channels to vent air pressure cut into it. If you don't use vented ones, I think what happens is one of your boots will swell up like a balloon and the other one will shrink down as you're steering back and forth, and that will lead to them either popping off or splitting prematurely and causing you a problem. Because of this, you can't just use the E30 inner and outer tie rods, and you can't use E36 inner and outers either because they're not vented. So what you need to do is use an E46 inner and an E36 outer. If you wanted to use both E46 inner and outer, supposedly the overall length will be too long, so you'll have a problem. So you need to combine E46 inner, E36 outer. And before you ask, you can't use E30 outers and E46 inners because the thread's male on an outer on an E30 and it would need to be female to work with the E46 inner. As great as this purple tag steering rack is, I think it's actually destined for a different car we have in the stables, so I'm not going to use it. Instead, what I'm going to use is this rack, which is the Z3 2.7 turn lock to lock rack from a 4-cylinder 1.9 litre Z3. Short of doing something fully custom, I think this is actually the quickest rack you can reasonably fit to an E30 at 2.7 turns. So if you're really serious about getting the responsiveness out of an E30, this is what you want really. It's the ultimate steering rack. As mentioned, it's specifically found in the 4-pot Z3s, the 1.9 litres, and it's an older style steering rack where it's half aluminium and half steel body. They're becoming a bit harder to find now and quite a bit more expensive to buy, and being something like 25 years old, your chance of finding one that you can throw straight on without doing any attention on is pretty slim. This one has actually had a full rebuild, which I sent away for at the cost of £275, which is quite a lot of money, especially on top of what I paid for it. Although admittedly I got a brilliant deal at £65, you can generally expect to pay around £100 or more for one of these racks in unknown condition. I'll put a link in the description to the company that I used to restore this rack, and to be honest, it was quite loose when I first received it, quite rusty, and the pipes leaked. So the company have definitely rebuilt it, it's all much stiffer, re-greased it, replaced the pipes and painted it black, although not that well. My only negative point about it is they managed to sandblast the tag, which I find a little bit annoying because it was nice to easily identify it. But hey ho, they've done a good job, so I'm quite pleased. The good news with the Z3 rack is I no longer need to worry about this vented inner tie rod issue with the purple tag one. So I can use, quite simply, an E36 inner and outer tie rod, and it should be a perfect fit up to this rack, and this end should fit up perfectly to the E36 knuckles that I'm using on this car because it's 5 lug swapped. In the interest of being thorough, there are other choices for steering racks than the two I'm offering up here. You could choose to use a standard E36 rack, which would be 3.4 turns lock to lock. That would maintain the retro handling of the car, I suppose, but worth noting those are very old racks as well as the Z3 one now, so the likelihood is, even though they're really cheap to buy, you'd probably have to get it rebuilt. Another option would be the E46 rack, which is the standard one. I think it's got a yellow tag, not certain, but that would be 3.2 turns lock to lock. On balance, I think the best option is probably the purple tag rack. That's probably the most intelligent option if value for money is a factor for you. And there are, of course, a host of non-powered manual steering racks that you could pick from, but to be honest, I'll leave those out because I have no experience of them, nor desire to experience them. What I really want is the most responsive E30 I can. I'm putting a lot of effort in here, so I might as well go for the ultimate steering rack in my opinion, which is the Z3 one. And the car will hopefully feel really responsive while I'm swerving down a B road dodging pheasants. Now, there is a little bit more to know when you're trying to swap the steering rack onto an E30. For starters, you'll notice when I had them lined up that the ports are in a slightly different place on the standard E30 rack. Now, you can use the original E30 lines if you bend them, which I think is what we're going to try to do, or there are custom lines that you can purchase at an additional cost, which I guess is the backup for if bending them causes a kink. The second point to mention is that there's quite a lot of space between the mounting tabs and one of these steering racks, and that's actually true for the purple tag steering rack as well as this Z3 steering rack, so this applies to both. So what you need are a pair of nice little 14mm spacers which will hopefully slot nicely in there and just pick up that slack so your steering rack's firmly mounted in its correct position. There's also the big question of which steering linkage to use, which in our case might be a bit more complicated than just reusing the original E30 steering linkage. Stick with me and I will cover that in more detail when I get to it. This is the first time I've actually installed this mod myself, so we're going to be figuring it out together, I guess. First things first, let me bring you up to speed on the project. Now, if you're a good subscriber, you'll notice I've been busy. And I've got the sound deadening, the heat shields, the front suspension, the front arms, and of course that reinforced front subframe fitted onto the car, which actually looks really good. That's been sat on a shelf for probably about a year, maybe even more, and now it's finally on the car, so I'm pleased about that. I'll just cut to some footage now so you can see how that went fairly smoothly really, but you can see for yourself. And if you're new to the channel, you're probably wondering where this E30's engine is. Now, I actually removed the old 4-pot M40 engine and I'm planning to fit the M52 engine, the 2.8, which is on this stand. Now, I mentioned that in particular because it does have a bearing on the steering linkage situation with this rack swap, but I'll touch on that later when we're a bit closer to it. Enough chatting. It's about time I put the tie rods on that steering rack and actually got it fitted into its new home. So let's crack on with that now. I'm going to set the track rod ends to match up with the previous overall length, which was 136 centimetres, obviously keeping them equal on both sides. Then I'll know at least I'm setting this initially in the right ballpark. Even though it wasn't right before, it was pretty close, so it's a great starting point. Right, that's about 136, which is close enough. I'm not going to tighten everything fully until it's on the car, and then I'll firm it all up. Right, so we're about ready to fit this new steering rack into its home on the E30's front subframe, and I'm realising that once this is bolted in firmly, the space between this spline and the spline on the end of the steering column is going to be fixed, and it's not going to give me enough wiggle room to get a steering linkage in. So what you need to do is you need to fit the steering linkage to one or the other end, and then it will all firm up into place as you fit the steering rack. Now, I keep mentioning that the steering rack's a particular point of interest with these swaps for me because of the engine swap. This is the original E30 steering linkage, and it's what I'm going to fit for now, just so I can get the car into a situation where it's got wheels on and it'll steer again. But I know the problem with these steering linkage when you've got an engine swap, or if you've got an interesting exhaust manifold on a standard engine, is the clearance becomes a problem and you start having issues where this will hit the exhaust manifold. So what I am planning to do is modify this Vauxhall Corsa steering linkage to work, and as you can see it's a much slimmer linkage compared to the E30 one. But let's not get distracted with this today. This is something to figure out in a future video, so do make sure you subscribe to find out how I actually sort that. But for now I'm going to fit this original E30 steering linkage onto the steering rack side, and the splines mate up nicely with a bit of a push. So let's get that done. The splines definitely match, but it's proving to be a very close fit. And there's only one way it'll go on, because the splines on the steering column side are coarser than the splines on the steering rack side. So this is definitely the right way. Right, you want to use the rear holes on the E30's front subframe, which is the correct place for powered steering racks. The front holes are actually for manual steering racks, but the rear holes put the powered ones in a better position to work, which brings us to our first snag. I've got the steering knuckle pressed on to the steering column splines all the way, won't go anymore, and there is a cutout on the splines on the steering rack side, which you probably saw earlier, which I thought was to allow for this bolt to go through to prevent them ever from coming off. Now, the problem with that is it's now locked in position and I can't get the rack any further back to line these holes up. So what I'm hoping to do is loosen this off, push it further onto these splines, and hope there's actually room to do it. Let's find out. Might need the hammer again. Yeah, there's no way I'm pushing that on. I'll just pop this bolt in the wrong way so this side doesn't drop down on me. That's good enough. That's it. Both fit really nice now. Good. You'll notice that the cutout I was lining up to before has gone a long way in now, but it's not catching on this bolt, so I'm not sure what that's for. And I've taken up the full splines on both the column and the rack, which, to be honest, seems a little bit tight, but I don't think we'll know there's a problem until we're actually turning the wheel back and forth, so we'll find out about that. But so far so good. I'll tighten it back up. With that done, I can now put my spacer in the top here and tighten this steering rack onto the subframe. Now I'm going to put the bolts from the underside because I suspect when there's an engine in here there'll be no way on earth you're getting the length of these bolts out from the top. So I'm not going to check, I'm just going to use my logic and put them in this way. Hopefully I'm right, tell me if I'm wrong. A bit tight with those spacers, but I guess it's to stop it moving around. Got it. She's tight. It's working very well. Straight shot. He says. Well, that's a bit of a problem, but I do have a cutting plan for that. Maybe not. On the steering column side, looking down there, the splines do interfere with the bolt hole, so I can't get the bolt through. It's funny how the one on the bottom was a no issue, whereas on the steering column side, it certainly is an issue. Luckily, I suspect this is going absolutely nowhere. There's no space for it to go up or down at this point, so I'm not that worried about it. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm not actually going to use this setup when I've got an engine in this car. It's just so I can shuffle the car around at will. So I'm not going to worry about that too much, but it's worth noting. Now I'm stood back and looking at this, I'm starting to question the choice of the inner holes for these steering rack mounts. Now, even if I use the outer holes, I don't think it would put this steering linkage in exactly the right position for the cutout on the rack and on the column, but I could probably get the bolt in the column if it was just moved a little bit. Further to that, have a look at this. If I roughly line up this end ball joint with where it needs to sit, look at the angle on this tie rod here. That's much more of an angle than I'd have expected. I thought the position of the rack wants to keep these as neutral as possible, really. So it might be that the things I read on the internet about using the inner hole isn't the optimal choice for using a Z3 rack. I need to do a little bit of research on that. Right, that's full lock left. We'll use this as our measure and let's see if it's actually 2.7 turns. 1, 2, 0.7-ish. Not bad. So that's what it'd be like on full lock, which is a bit less of an extreme angle. And that's the other way, a bit more of an angle. Not outrageous, but it is more of an angle than I expected. Now I've steered the wheel fully left and right, I can confirm that there's no binding on that linkage, which I thought was a risk with it being in there so tight. I am a little bit worried about that, to be honest. I wouldn't be happy to run the car with it seeming so tight in that space on those splines. Now, I've also done a quick Google just to confirm that I wasn't making it up about using the inner holes on the subframe, because theoretically I do think it might be in a slightly better position with this rack on the outer holes, but the internet does clearly say in a couple of places from multiple sources, I don't know how trustworthy, that using the inner holes with a powered rack is the correct thing to do and will result in better steering feel. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and leave it on the inner position at the moment, and when I come back to change the linkage before I do the engine swap, that's when I'm hopefully going to be a bit more clued up and I can decide if I'm going to go against the grain and move it out to the outer holes or not. But let's continue. So this one's toeing out just very slightly. The other one looks really good, so for an eyeball alignment, not too bad. So I'm going to tighten it in a thread or two on this side, just to bring the front of that wheel in, and then I'm going to tighten up the locks, and that's good enough for the car to roll around for now. Obviously I'll be getting a proper alignment in the end. Right, so because I want to pull the front of this passenger side wheel in just a touch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to twiddle this bar around on the inner tie rod, which will thread it into the outer tie rod just a touch more to pull the wheel in. So first things first, I need to loosen that locker, which is a 22. And then this bar is a 13, which I'm going to carefully twist in. Might have to fiddle with this a couple of times yet, but I'll keep checking it. Right, so I've twiddled that back and forth a couple of times, and I've got it to where I think it's about right, and I've took the car off the handbrake and rolled it back and forwards just to make sure it's settled. And by eye, I'm quite happy with how they both look, both wheels. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to tighten up these lockers. But I need to make sure this doesn't turn, because now I've got it where I want it. There we go. So that's the power steering pipework vaguely mocked into place with the reservoir on its mounting bracket and the actual pump itself in approximately the right place on these blocks if it was actually mounted to an engine. Obviously there's a big question with this part because I'm doing an M52 swap, so I doubt this will be the pump I'm using on this end of the lines. So that's just there, just so we can get a visual. And I'm realising the error of my ways a little bit with this, because these two pipes here are supposed to fit in that gap between the tabs, between the subframe and the steering rack. And that's going to be very difficult to do now I've bolted it in place. However, as discussed previously, I will need to take this linkage back out to give it attention, which is probably going to be the next episode. So at that point, I'm going to be putting these lines in and working out how to bend them. Once I have taken this rack off to remove the linkage and slipped these pipes into the home here, I think at that point I'm going to have a clearer understanding of how I need to bend these pipes and if it's even possible to fit these new ports on this Z3 rack. Looking at it right now, I'm not 100% sure it is going to be possible, but I don't think I'm going to know until they're in the right mounting positions. So that's going to need to be something I address in the next episode as well. Well, it's been a pretty productive day to be honest, and I'm really happy with how that steering rack's gone on. And it feels great turning the wheel. Obviously I'm not really going to know what it feels like until it's powered, but generally pretty happy. Now make sure you subscribe so you can see what actually happens with the linkage and the lines, which I'm planning to do in the next episode. But I'm really happy to see the car back on four wheels again, even without an engine. And now I can even roll it out because I have other cars that need to come in here for some attention actually. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please make sure you subscribe and I'll see you in the next episode.